Elias Fairbanks and the land that refused to stay quiet. In the spring of 1839, Elias Fairbanks arrived at the edge of Andover County with little more than a traveling surveyor's signature and a whisper of intent. He was not a man of spectacle, nor did he come with fanfare or formal introduction. The deed transfer for the 40 acres of orchard land was filed quietly, almost as if the paper signed itself. The surveyor who handled the transaction left town before the week's end, not seen again in Andover or anywhere nearby. The land, a half-forgotten stretch of blackened soil and gnarled fig trees, had been abandoned for years, rejected by every hand that tried to tame it. Locals remembered it for its bitter fruit and twice-failed revivals by traveling preachers who claimed to bring salvation and harvest, only to vanish before the second frost. Elias, by contrast, stayed. He was a soft-spoken man, often seen with a book bound in brown leather and stitched with symbols most mistook for scripture. His voice never rose. His eyes never lingered too long, and yet there was something in his manner, gentle but absolute, that made even the most skeptical farmer nod along when he spoke. They said his speech carried the weight of verses not yet written. Within 2 months of his arrival, a small timber chapel had appeared on the eastern ridge of the orchard. It bore no bell, no cross, and no sign to announce its denomination. But it stood upright and immovable, a slender silhouette against the horizon like a spine jutting from the earth. The townsfolk noticed but did not intervene. Elias Fairbanks had the polite air of a man already forgiven for something you didn't yet understand. And his family, though odd in behavior, never gave reason for complaint. His wife, Ada, was a woman of few words, her whisper lighter than breeze. She spent her days tending to vines that bore no fruit, coaxing them with hands too reverent for farming. Of their 3 children, Nell, Mercy, and the youngest boy, known only as Rev, not one attended the schoolhouse, nor were they ever seen with toys or lessons. They were pale, tightly groomed, and silent in a way that made others feel the need to lower their voices in their presence. They seemed less like children and more like figures from a hymn half forgotten but never fully erased. Candlelight gatherings and the rise of stillness. By midsummer, strange habits had begun to take root in the orchard's shadows. At twilight, candlelight could be seen flickering through the orchard rows, not from within the chapel, but scattered in a circular pattern near the southern slope, where the oldest fig trees bent inward like mourners at a grave. Neighbors first assumed these were prayer vigils or late-season harvesting rituals. But they soon realized no crops were being gathered and no hymns were being sung. The gatherings consisted not of sermons nor songs nor scripture readings. Instead, those who attended, many of whom had long turned away from church, described the event in terms more suited to rituals than worship. There were no pews, only dirt, no altar, only the stillness of air too thick for breath. People stood barefoot even in the cool evening dew and listened not to Elias, but to the silence between his words. He spoke softly, yes, but rarely. And when he did, it was in a cadence that suggested he wasn't trying to teach, but trying to remember something. Sometimes the only sound was the salt being poured in circles at the gathering's edge. Other times it was the subtle crunch of dirt shifting beneath bare feet, as if the orchard itself exhaled through the soil. What drew people there wasn't doctrine or promise, but sensation. Some described it as being seen not by Elias, but by something behind him. Others said it was like hearing a lullaby their grandmothers never sang aloud. Even those who claimed not to believe in anything found themselves returning their excuses, thin their eyes darker than before. Children were not permitted to attend, yet they began drawing circles in the dust outside their homes. And though no one admitted to teaching them, the patterns matched those traced in salt in the orchard. Within a few weeks, the gatherings expanded. Settlers from the surrounding ridges, once resistant to anything resembling religious revival, stood side by side with town elders, all listening for something beneath the stillness. As the nights lengthened and the leaves blackened on their stems, the orchard did not change in appearance, but it no longer looked the same. People began referring to it not as the Fairbanks land, but simply as the ground, a name with no warmth, a place that didn't belong to Elias or his family, or even Andover anymore. The stone structure and the question no one asked. In the early months of 1840, just as frost began to recede from the ridges, a second structure appeared near the chapel. Unlike the first, this one was built from thick, dark stone, its mortar embedded with something glossy and red. It had no windows, and its iron-banded door was heavy enough that even two strong men struggled to budge it. No sound came from within. No chimney expelled smoke. When asked about it casually, nervously, Elias simply replied that it was for containment. No one asked what that meant. Not because they weren't curious, but because they already knew it wasn't a question with a safe answer. The word itself, containment, didn't suggest storage. It suggested struggle. It suggested something inside was still trying. And yet Elias remained serene, unfazed, his voice always tempered with that same stitched scripture tone. Sanctity, he said when someone pressed further. It is a place for sanctity, not safety. That word lingered in the minds of those who heard it, not because they understood, but because they didn't. Strangely, it made them feel safer. Somehow the very existence of that sealed structure, menacing though it was, brought a grim kind of comfort, as if the presence of a prison meant the monster hadn't yet escaped. But of course no one admitted to thinking that. They only nodded and looked away, whispering about the Fairbanks family in the same tones they once used for thunderstorms and dying cows, unavoidable, natural, and best left undisturbed. Rumors spread that Elias never entered the structure himself, but that his wife Ada was seen placing jars of soil at its base, soil pulled from beneath the fig trees, still damp and slick with sap. Others claimed the boy Rev was once seen standing at its door with his hand pressed flat against the iron eye's closed mouth, moving in slow, rhythmic patterns. Whether he was praying or listening, no one could agree, but what all could agree on was this. Ever since the stone structure was built, the land around it had grown unnaturally quiet, not peaceful, but holding its breath. And the chapel's candles, once warm and golden, now flickered blue. Unspoken tongues and the lure of the unknowable. By the end of autumn 1840, the gatherings at the orchard took on a more unsettling tone. Those in attendance began to whisper not about what was said, but about what wasn't. It was the silence between phrases that haunted them, not dead air, but something living in the pause, like a breath held too long, or a thought that dared not surface. Elias Fairbanks spoke less often than before, and when he did, the cadence shifted into rhythms that bypassed comprehension altogether. Words fell from his lips like stones into a deep well, words that did not echo, yet stirred something deep and cold in the listener's marrow. Some said he was speaking in Latin, though no one could translate what he said. Others swore it was no language at all, but sound, strung together in a way that made the bones of the skull vibrate. One woman claimed she dreamt in those same syllables the night after attending, and though she woke unable to recall them, her nose bled onto the pillow as if something had been extracted. There were no hymns, no psalms, only Elias, and occasionally the boy called Rev, both whispering to the soil, and to those who had learned not to fear the silence that answered. But it wasn't the language that lingered, it was what followed. A silence so thick, so sudden, it made the pulse in one's ears ring like bells submerged in water. That silence pressed down on the lungs. It lodged behind the teeth. It refused to be expelled even with breath. More than one attendee collapsed, not from fainting, but from stillness too profound to bear. And yet they came back, always, with eyes darker, slower to blink, lips slightly parted like they were still listening. The orchard's soil had begun to darken, not with decay, but with richness, as though it remembered the feet that stood on it. And at night, the old fig trees swayed even when the wind slept. Locals tried to explain the growing pull of the gatherings with rational words, curiosity, community, perhaps even nostalgia. But no one believed themselves. The truth was simpler and less comfortable. They felt seen, and they didn't know by what. Catherine Holt and the disappearance. No one reported. The first girl to vanish was never officially declared missing. Her name was Catherine Holt, 17 Quiet, the only daughter of a widowed seamstress who lived near the northern fork of the trail. Catherine had always been odd in the softest ways, too still when spoken to, too eager to walk barefoot, even in autumn, too curious about things that ought not to be known. She was last seen at dusk, slipping between the trees near the Fairbanks Orchard. No coat, no lantern, just her hands clasped in front of her like a parishioner preparing for confession. Her mother claimed she had gone to attend a lesson with Mercy. Fairbanks, who had begun tutoring unruly girls, those expelled or shunned from the main schoolhouse. But when Catherine failed to return that night, her mother didn't alert the town. Instead, she lit the porch lamp and sat vigil through the night, murmuring to herself in half-finished prayers. It wasn't until the second morning that a quiet, reluctant search was assembled. No posters, no alarm, just neighbors, boots and torches moving through the woods like people too ashamed to admit they feared what they might find. Elias Fairbanks himself guided the search, walking ahead with bare hands, reciting names no one had told him. He knew the land too well, leading others through roots and ravines as if tracing a map written into his blood. For 3 days they searched. Then they stopped. No one said it out loud, but they all knew Catherine hadn't gone missing. She had gone. Her mother stopped speaking within the week. She kept the porch lamp lit for almost a year. No one saw her at market, and when winter came, her windows frosted from the inside. Reverend Tillman, who had once tried and failed to baptize the Fairbanks boy, was asked months later if he thought Catherine had died. He answered slowly, "No, she chose to stay." He would not explain further. Some girls, he added, are born closer to the veil than others. He never clarified what that veil was. Dr. Greaves and the book, with no letters. In February of 1841, snowbound roads forced a traveling physician named Dr. Alton Greaves to spend 3 nights in Andover on his way to Bangor. A man of science, Greaves prided himself on rational thought and precise observation. He kept meticulous journals, scribbling margins full of notes, weather patterns, and physiological symptoms. On the second night, drawn by curiosity more than faith, he attended one of the Fairbanks twilight gatherings. What he witnessed undid him. He wrote of stillness so deep it felt intentional, as if the gathered congregation had rehearsed their silence until it became sacred. Elias stood before them, reciting from a large leather-bound book that bore no visible writing. Greaves strained to see letters, but the pages appeared blank, yet Elias read with unwavering fluency. The language was not English, and Greaves could not place its roots, but it stirred the room like a string pulled tight. Women wept without tears. Men trembled without moving. And then the boy. Rev stepped forward and approached a man seated near the front. He laid his hand upon the man's forehead, and without a sound the man collapsed. Not unconscious, but writhing, his back arched, his mouth wide open, his eyes rolled back. Yet no one moved to help. No one even flinched. The boy said nothing, and the silence that followed Greaves wrote was denser than sound. He left town before dawn, refusing breakfast escort or further explanation. In the margins of his journal, next to a crude sketch of a tree with open mouths in its branches, he wrote 5 words and underlined them in charcoal. They are not burying the dead. No one ever saw him in Andover again. The ritual marks and the preacher who left without a word. By the fall of 1841, quiet rumors had begun to thread their way across the fence lines and firewood stacks of Andover County. People didn't share them in taverns or markets, only over fences in whispers, as if even speaking the words aloud would summon something from the orchard. The most persistent rumor began with a boy from the Mayweather family, just 12 years old. He returned from one of the Fairbanks gatherings, shirtless, his chest carved with a pattern of shallow scratches that stopped just short of drawing blood. The wounds were oddly symmetrical, cross-hatched, almost ornamental, neither animal nor accident. When his mother tried to dress the wounds, he refused. "It's part of the cleansing," he said, eyes unblinking. "It has to stay open." He wouldn't say more, and his skin began to form pale ridges as if the scratches were meant not to heal, but to become part of him. Concerned the town's circuit preacher, a man named Josiah Raymer, who had served the rural settlements for over 20 years, confronted Elias Fairbanks directly. Raymer arrived unannounced during one of the evening gatherings and demanded to speak after the ceremony. Witnesses say Elias simply nodded and invited him to attend the next service as a guest. The preacher did attend, seated in the very front row, hands folded tightly over a leather Bible. He did not interrupt. He did not speak. When the gathering ended, he walked away without offering a blessing or farewell. Within a week, he resigned his post and left for Vermont. He did not write a letter of explanation. He did not say goodbye to his congregation. He simply vanished, taking nothing with him but the shoes on his feet and the silence inside him. 2 families moved west that same winter, though they gave no reason. They left their cabins stocked and their fields unharvested. Snow covered the ground within days, but never seemed to settle on the orchard. The branches of the fig trees stayed slick with sap glistening unnaturally, even in the bitter cold. One farmer who ventured too close during a storm claimed the trees wept not from the bark, but from beneath the roots, like the ground itself was mourning something it could not name. The letter from Mercy and the mothers who chose to remember. In March of 1842, strange letters began arriving at certain homes across Andover County. always addressed to women, never to men. The envelopes bore no names, no return addresses, just a wax seal imprinted with the outline of a split fig. Inside the paper was thick-yellowed and handwritten with a single line. "We have seen her sorrow. We can return what was taken." Most women, upon opening the message, burned it immediately. Some cursed aloud, others wept without knowing why. The seal alone was enough to inspire dread. But a few, especially those who had buried daughters, infants, or stillborns in recent years, did not look away. They walked. Not in groups, not with ceremony, but alone on foot down toward the orchard. One of the first was Clara Ara Dunn. Her child had died in childbirth nearly a year prior, and she had not spoken more than a sentence at a time since. She returned from the orchard, pale and trembling, cradling a muslin blanket she swore was the same one she'd buried. She refused to answer questions, only muttering, "He let me hold her again." But not for long. That night, Clara built a fire taller than her roof and stood beside it until dawn. The flames consumed something wrapped tightly, something she never named. From that night on, she never again attended service anywhere else, not at the town chapel, not in private prayer circles. Only the orchard held her devotion now. Others followed, quietly, anonymously. A trail of women with sunken eyes and folded grief drawn not by promise but by presence. Some returned with small tokens. Locks of hair, cracked baptismal spoons, tiny linen bonnets that had long since been buried. One woman came back with nothing but a smear of salt across her palms and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Rev's prophecy and the family that matched the date. By the summer of 1843, the Fairbanks boy still called. Only Rev had begun to outgrow any description that could be comfortably labeled child. Though he had never stepped inside a schoolhouse, never learned to read in any way people understood, adults in town had begun to refer to him not with affection, but with caution. Words like gifted gave way to touched, and then to nothing at all. No one quite knew how to address him. He was no longer someone's son. He was something other. He rarely spoke, but when he did, it was with a stillness so sharp it seemed to cut the air. At the midsummer gathering in front of a crowd of 27, he stood barefoot before the chapel, lifted his chin and whispered a list of names none had ever heard. Each name was followed by a date still to come. He didn't shout. He didn't pause, and yet every person there heard each word clearly, even those far at the back. Weeks later, a family of 5 passing through Andover was found dead near Black Timber Creek. Their wagon intact, no valuables missing. Their bodies bore the same cross-hatched wounds the Mayweather boy once showed. The date Rev had spoken matched exactly the morning they were discovered. Sheriff Albin Cross, newly appointed, not yet worn down by the town's growing dread, insisted it was highwaymen, though no signs of struggle or theft could be found. No one challenged him, but no one believed him either. After that, Rev was no longer seen playing near the chapel. In fact, no one remembered seeing him move unless he had purpose. His presence became like smoke-filling rooms he hadn't entered, leaving behind the scent of myrrh and something metallic. Men stopped looking him in the eye. Children stopped whispering his name. And those who dreamed of him dreamed not of a boy, but of a voice coming from beneath the orchard soil, asking a single question. "Do you remember what we planted?" Out-of-season blossoms and the humming beneath the soil. In the summer of 1844, something impossible happened. The orchard bloomed. The fig trees, long thought sterile and twisted by some ancestral grief, suddenly burst into pale blossoms, curling like parchment at the tips. They bloomed all at once, too quickly, too perfectly, as though summoned rather than grown. Locals who wandered close remarked not on their beauty, but their silence. No bees came, no birds sang, no scent of nectar clung to the air. The petals gave off a soft, almost bitter fragrance like salt soaked in old parchment. Stranger still, the blossoms never dropped. They clung to their branches through storms and dry spells alike, as if they had forgotten how to fall. Children who ventured near returned pale and skittish, unable or unwilling to describe what they'd seen. One girl, the blacksmith's niece, said she had heard music coming from beneath the soil. Not music in the way adults understood it. No melody, no instruments, but a low pulsing hum that vibrated through her ribs and stayed with her long after she'd been brought home. She said it sounded like praying, but without words. Just intention. Another child swore she had seen hands beneath the trees. Not bodies, just hands folding and unfolding in the dirt, pale and long-fingered as if in constant supplication. Her parents sent her away that same week, packed her things, and sent her to cousins 3 counties over. They never spoke of it again. When neighbors asked what had frightened her, the mother simply replied, "She looked too long, that's all." Then the path appeared. It did not wind, it did not twist. It simply was a clean corridor through the thickest part of the grove, where no tools had ever cleared. The ground was smooth, pressed into wide indentations that seemed too large for human feet, too shallow for hooves. And at night, under moonlight, it glowed faintly with a soft silver sheen, like something breathing beneath the moss. Elias Fairbanks began leading his candle-lit processions down this path, carrying only a single glass lantern that flickered not with fire, but something colder. Those who followed him returned changed. Some smiled too brightly, others refused to speak at all. And then came Ezra, a local farm boy barely 13 who tried to follow the procession one night alone. He came back before dawn, barefoot and bleeding, unable to speak. His tongue had been severed cleanly, precisely as though by intention. His boots were never found, the arrival of the pilgrims of the second soil. In the summer leading up to the 1845 harvest, the orchard began drawing strangers. They did not arrive by wagon or coach. They came on foot, always alone, as though summoned by something the rest of the world couldn't hear. These travelers bore no family, no visible purpose, and spoke rarely, if at all. Their clothing was plain but oddly stitched with symbols, interwoven patterns like roots wrapping through bones. Some wore prayer beads carved from what looked like bone. Others carried satchels that gave off a scent of rot and flowers, sweet and nauseating all at once. They never knocked on doors. They simply stood near the orchard at dusk waiting. And Elias Fairbanks greeted each one by name. No introductions were exchanged. No records had been sent ahead. Yet he would step from the chapel and say, "Welcome, Callum. Welcome, Mireia. We've prepared for you," as if these names had lived in his mouth for years. Within a week of their arrival, a crude dormitory was erected beside the stone structure, low-roofed, windowless, and shingled, not with wood, but with overlapping cypress bark. It seemed to grow rather than be built. Locals watched them move like ants, wordless and coordinated, building in silence. The dormitory accepted dozens. No one saw who slept where, and no one ever saw a fire lit inside. A retired preacher named Tillman, still haunted by his encounter years prior, muttered under his breath when he saw the pilgrims arrive. "They're pilgrims of the second soil." No one knew what it meant, but the name stuck. After their arrival, the land itself began to pulse. At first it was subtle, a warmth in the earth beneath bare feet. But soon the farmers whose land bordered the orchard began noticing things. A tingling beneath their fingernails, milk turning bitter without spoiling, the sound of pages turning in empty rooms. One man said he found his fields tilting slightly as if the orchard were leaning toward him like a mouth preparing to speak. Then came the old man. Amos Cribben, a town elder, stood during supper one Sunday evening and calmly announced that he would be offering his property to the Fairbanks. "The land doesn't need me anymore," he said. "It wants them now." His sons argued, his wife sobbed, but Amos had already burned the deed. That night he walked barefoot to the orchard, left his boots on the chapel steps, and was never seen again. The next morning, where the pulpit met the soil, there was a shallow depression, freshly turned earth without a single shovel mark. The scent that rose from it was not decay, but myrrh and vinegar. By week's end, 2 more elders followed. Each left behind a note written in flowing, elegant script that mimicked scripture, but no church could trace the verses. The Fairbanks family made no public acknowledgement, no thanks, no ceremony, and yet the dormitory grew larger, the hush house and the hall of mirrors. The third building rose without warning. It was not built from wood, not from stone. It shimmered as if wet, though rain hadn't touched it. The walls were dark like bark, glazed with pitch and warm to the touch. Children who dared call it by name whispered, "Hush house," with eyes wide and voices low. Adults did not name it at all. It stood behind the chapel, taller than both the dormitory and the stone structure, but narrower, almost knife-like in silhouette. No doors marked its face, no windows cut into its skin. Only a thin vertical seam, like a scar healed wrong, ran from its roof to the soil. It never opened, it never moved, but people began to dream about its inside. One woman claimed she saw her deceased daughter standing before it in a vision, her mouth sewn shut with vines. A school teacher awoke with dirt beneath her fingernails and the memory of mirrors that reflected nothing. A farm hand, too drunk to resist curiosity, approached the hush house at dawn. He returned by noon and refused to speak for 7 days. When he finally opened his mouth, he said, "There's no air inside, but it still listens." One day, someone glimpsed the interior. Edna Parlow, a washerwoman who lived alone, claimed she saw through a slat in the warped boards. Inside, she said, were mirrors, but not ones that showed faces. They showed memories. She described a stone basin at the center of the room filled not with water, but with loose teeth too many to belong to any one person. She said songs filled the air, but not songs you could hear, songs you felt in your ribs like thunder too deep to echo. The next day, she disappeared. Her wash tub remained full. Her clothes were folded, and the wind from the orchard blew all night long, but not a single ripple stirred her water. After that, no one approached the hush house again. Not willingly. Here are the next 3 expanded segments. Segments 13 to 15 continuing the descent into the uncanny world of Fairbanks Orchard, each written in the same haunting tone and style, between 450 to 600 words per section. The Invitations of Mercy Fairbanks. By the spring of 1846, something had changed in Mercy Fairbanks. She had always been quiet, more shadow than child, rarely seen apart from her siblings. But now she began to appear alone, wandering the dusty roads beyond the orchard in a simple cotton dress, bare feet stained red with the iron-rich soil. Her hair, once braided tightly, now hung loose, and her eyes had taken on a distant sheen, like she was constantly listening to something only she could hear. She knocked on doors, but only once, never twice. If no one answered, she moved on. If someone opened the door, she asked the same question in the same calm voice. Do you wish to speak with the ones who remember you, most shut their doors with trembling hands? They claimed afterward they didn't know why they were afraid, only that something about her presence felt too old, too familiar, like a childhood memory misplaced for a reason. But those who hesitated, who paused even a moment, woke the next morning to find something left on their doorstep. Not threats, not tokens of warning, just reminders. A child's braid tied with string, a prayer card from a church that had burned decades before, a wooden doll, eyeless, limp, but warm to the touch. One woman, Judith Clymer, whose only son had drowned the year before, followed Mercy back to the orchard without hesitation. Neighbors saw her walk barefoot down the path, clutching her son's baby shoe. She was seen entering the hush house, her hand briefly grazing the dark door. She was never seen again. Her husband said nothing for days. Then, without announcement, he plowed under all his fields and salted the soil until it ran white. She left, he said, when someone asked. She chose to remember. No one asked what that meant. Ruth Elsie and the return of the unremembered. In the fall of 1846, a woman named Ruth Elsie returned to Andover after 20 years away. She had left as a child, carried west by her mother after a fire consumed their home near the Lower Grove. Now widowed Ruth came to settle her father's estate. She claimed to have no memory of the orchard, only a faint sense of unease whenever she walked past its edge, like her bones were tugging at her flesh, trying to step backward. She took lodging in a small cottage overlooking the chapel. Within days, she was seen pacing the orchard path at dusk lips, moving silently, her hands brushing the bark of trees like they were old friends. Neighbors heard her humming a lullaby. When asked about it, she insisted no one had ever taught her. On the 7th night, Ruth disappeared into the orchard. She was found the next morning sitting cross-legged atop her father's old boundary stone, her hands covered in soil. She had dug a small hole and filled it with the bones of something delicate animal, maybe though no one could identify it with certainty. When questioned, she looked up calmly and said, "I remembered what I was supposed to forget. Now it's their turn to keep it." Then she smiled and refused to speak again. That winter became the warmest in memory. Snow fell only once, and it melted before morning. Instead, fog gathered thick and low, clinging to the orchard like breath held too long. Trees seemed taller, shadows longer, and Andover entered a season not marked by weather but by stillness, the hour of blue silence and the saints without names. As the year turned, the people of Andover began to speak of a strange phenomenon, the hour of blue silence. It came just before dawn, between the last breath of night and the first twitch of light. During this hour, no birds called. No dogs barked, no hearths crackled. Even the wind, restless in winter, stilled its steps. Time itself felt paused, as though the world were waiting for something that hadn't yet arrived, or perhaps for something ancient to stir again. Figures were seen moving between the Fairbanks buildings during that hour. Not clearly, not human exactly. Tall, veiled shapes gliding more than walking their heads. bowed hands, folded their presents, acknowledged only by the way animals scattered and doors bolted themselves. Their feet left no prints even in frost. Their shapes refused to reflect in windows. One man, a trapper named Willard Cobb, tried to approach them with a lantern. He made it only to the first row of fig trees before stopping cold. He stood unmoving for nearly an hour. When he returned, his beard had turned completely white. He didn't speak for 3 days. When he finally did, all he said was, "Their saints wear no names." He left town that same night. His cabin was found empty. The bed made the fire still warm. He was never seen again. After that, no one entered the orchard willingly. But everyone felt it creeping closer, not through roots or vines, but through dreams, through lost time, through the way children began drawing spirals into frost and humming songs no one had taught them. The orchard, they said, had begun remembering. The census taker who was already counted. In the spring of 1847, a census taker named Percal Gray arrived in Andover from Augusta. A quiet man known for his precision, Gray carried a thick leather ledger, several spare nibs, and a reputation for asking no more than what was required. His instructions were clear: update population counts, verify dwellings, and move along. He had no interest in rumors, and yet every road he followed led eventually to the orchard. There was no marked gate, no official boundary. Just a thinning of trees that opened as he approached, like the land had been expecting him. Gray entered near dusk, hoping to finish before dark. He knocked on doors, no answer, but none were locked. The buildings welcomed him like a dream. Half remembered the chapel, the dormitory, even the infamous Hush House. Each was clean, cold, perfectly preserved. No cobwebs, no footprints. Candles burned, but no matches were found. Beds were made, but their linens untouched by warmth. In the chapel, Gray found a shelf lined with 13 identical books. Their pages were blank, except for one. On its final leaf, a message had been etched in what appeared to be salt. "We have already been counted. You are next." He left before nightfall, abandoning his records. He did not complete his report. When questioned by the Augusta office, weeks later, he resigned without explanation. By midsummer, the soil near the orchard began to behave strangely. Wells closest to the grove ran dry, even while the ground remained moist and fragrant. Crops planted along the border line withered not from drought, but from something else, something unseen. The roots turned to ash. The earth gave off a hissing sound when touched. That season, small round holes began to appear in the fields, perfectly circular, shallow and empty. A curious boy filled one with salt. By morning, the salt was gone. In its place lay a bundle of hair tied with twine. That same day, the boy's younger sister stopped speaking altogether. When asked what had happened, she scrawled a single word on the barn wall in chalk buried. Her family left the county within the week. Their barn burned the following night. When the ashes cooled, the word remained charred into the stone foundation, like a brand. The letter with no stamp and the saints that rose. Later that year, a letter arrived at the Andover post office. No name. No return address, no postage, just a pale parchment envelope sealed in crimson wax, warm to the touch. On the outside, written in a flowing, near calligraphic hand, "To the people of Andover." Inside, a single page, aged, yellowed but uncreased, held a message written in verse. "And the orchard shall open its mouth, and those who are planted in sorrow shall rise in obedience. Their tongues will be folded, their names unspoken, and they shall be called the quiet saints. No one knew where the passage came from. No scripture matched. No elder recognized its cadence, but everyone knew what it meant. That night, 13 wooden chairs were arranged in a perfect circle at the orchard's edge. No one saw who placed them. No one dared touch them. They remained undisturbed for 3 days, untouched by wind or rain. On the 4th day, the chairs vanished. In their place were 13 mounds of soil, each marked with a fig branch bent and tied into the shape of a crown. And still the Fairbanks said nothing. No sermons were held. No sermons were needed. The orchard had begun to speak in silence, and silence was the only language the town had left, the processions and the silence that walked. As autumn deepened, the orchard came alive, not with noise but with movement. Processions began at twilight. First children, then mothers, then the elderly, those too frail to walk without help. They carried black wax candles, and each wore a strip of linen tied across their mouths. They walked in lines of 13 eyes, open but unfocused. Observers hiding among the trees noted that the door of the hush house opened before the first walker arrived and closed after the last had entered. Not a word was spoken. Not a footstep was heard. Even the leaves beneath their feet seemed to still themselves out of reverence or fear. Edna Parlow, the washerwoman who once glimpsed the inside of the hush house, told one final tale before she vanished. She claimed to have seen inside again through a gap in the wall. She spoke of mirrors warped and high as the rafters, reflecting nothing at all. A stone basin again full of teeth, baby teeth yellowed and clean. She claimed there was music not heard, but felt vibrations that resonated in her ribs and made her eyes water. She disappeared the next morning. Her wash was still in the tub. Her front door was ajar. The wind had blown in all night, but the water had not rippled once. After that, even the brave stopped watching the procession. They simply turned their backs, closed their doors, and tried to forget. But the orchard did not forget. The children from the North Woods, and the bloom of the bell. In early November 1846, just as frost began curling at the edges of window panes, 3 children arrived in Andover. They came from the North Woods, their clothing too light for the cold, their eyes dull with exhaustion. The oldest, a girl of about 15, spoke for them. She claimed they had fled a place where people spoke with needles and books bled when opened. No one understood what she meant, but the townsfolk couldn't ignore the long, half-healed scar beneath her jaw, a twisted glyph that looked like a fig pierced with thorns. Sheriff Albin Cross took them in, set up a cot for them in the jailhouse. But before morning, the children vanished. No door had opened. No lock had been broken. The only clue left behind was a trail of pale fig blossoms scattered across the floor, blooming weeks out of season, too soft to have been carried by shoes too fresh to have fallen naturally. A search was mounted at dawn. Dogs refused to track. Horses bucked and resisted the orchard path. Snow began to fall, but only away from the grove. A mist rose from the orchard soil, thick as soup, clinging to clothes and curling into ears like breath with weight. Then the bell rang. The chapel bell, long silent, cracked and rusting, let out one singular toll. No rope had been hung, no mechanism had been repaired, and yet the sound echoed across the valley, deep, mournful, uninvited. By midday the fig trees were weeping, not sap. Something darker, thicker than blood but thinner than pitch. It oozed from cracks in the bark, pooling at the base of each trunk. A farmhand named Josiah Kemp, driven by grim curiosity, collected a vial and brought it to the apothecary. When exposed to air, the liquid hissed violently, burning through cork and glass within an hour. Kemp fell ill that night. Feverish, delirious, he muttered fragments in languages no one recognized, fig above bone below, hunger beneath roots. He died before dawn. His body decayed within a day. What remained was a ring of dried soil shaped like a crown where he had laid. The orchard was declared cursed, but no one left, not really. Some tried to leave, but every soul who had once walked beneath the orchard's branches always returned. The counting that never stopped. By the final weeks of 1847, Andover had become a town of silence. The last recorded census listed 116 residents, but fewer than half were seen in public. Curtains remained drawn even at noon. Doors stayed bolted. Windows were covered not just with drapes, but with newspaper boards, fig leaves tacked from the inside. Those who ventured out wore scarves in the heat, hands pressed to their throats, eyes sunken and searching. No one sang, no one spoke unless necessary. Words had begun to feel fragile, liable to shatter if used carelessly. A child was seen drawing in the dirt near the well, a broken twig in her hand. Fig shapes, then teeth, then rows of mouths. When asked what she was drawing, she looked up with a stillness far too old for her face and said, "I'm counting the ones who sleep standing up." Her parents claimed illness. The sheriff, still holding on to some splinter of duty, marked the house for visitation. He never followed through. That same week, a school teacher named Miriam Knott stood mid-lesson, her voice calm but slow. She set her chalk down, walked out of the classroom barefoot, and headed toward the orchard. She stood for hours at the edge of the hush house, unmoving, lips parted like she was waiting to inhale something that had not yet arrived. When she returned, her fingernails were black. Her voice was gone. She handed each student a page torn from her lesson book. On each page, the same sentence repeated 13 times in her looping, neat hand. "You are remembered. You are remembered. You are remembered." The bell tower and the invitation of light. On the final night of 1847, the bell tower, abandoned, weather-worn, long since silenced, struck 13 times at midnight. No rope was attached. The clapper had long since been removed. The gears were rusted into stillness, yet the tolls rang out as clear as silver over water, waking every living soul within Andover's valley. That same moment, a light appeared inside the hush house, not firelight, not lantern glow. It was blue and slow pulsing beneath the door like breath made visible. A light that didn't shine so much as remember. Witnesses claimed to see shapes on the roof, unmoving, outstretched, arms wide, heads tilted back. One man, Henry Mott, swore he saw his dead sister among them, her white nightgown caught in windless air. He ran toward the orchard, shouting her name barefoot. He was never seen again. By morning, his boots were found neatly placed on the chapel steps, each boot filled with rich, dark soil and tiny white fig blossoms, fresh, damp, uncrushed. That day no birds flew over Andover. The wind shifted east, and every door in town stood ajar. Inside each home, someone or something had left a single branch of fig on the threshold. Fresh, green, slick with moisture that smelled faintly of iron and salt. By January, Andover was no longer a town moving forward. Time had curled inward like roots under rot. Clocks spun too fast or refused to tick. Candles burned quicker in some homes, slower in others. Days bled together. The sun hung wrong in the sky, too pale, too distant, too still. And at the center of it all, the orchard. unchanging, holding its breath. The orchard that refused to forget. By the first thaw of 1848. Time no longer flowed in, Andover had pooled. Snow still fell across the county, but never landed beneath the orchard's canopy. It hovered, dissolved, disappeared, before touching the ground, as though the grove exhaled warmth that did not melt, but rejected winter. The fig trees remained in bloom, though no bees came to visit. No fruit appeared, just petals clinging like skin that refused to shed. Ben Cooley, a hunter known for his stoicism, decided to test what others would not. He walked the orchard's boundary line just after dawn under a sky smeared with ash-pink clouds. He took one step beyond the first fig root and paused. The wind stopped, not slowed. Stopped. Not a bird called. Not a twig snapped. He stood still for nearly an hour, boots firm in the snow. When he returned, he refused to speak for 3 days. His wife found the soles of his boots blackened and curled upward as if they had been scorched. Yet he had been standing on snow. Word of the orchard's unnatural weather began to spread. Farmers in neighboring counties came to see the trees that did not shiver, the soil that never froze. Most left uneasy, a few left changed, and one man stayed. He came from Dover, calling himself a scholar of biblical prophecy. He carried a satchel of chalked sigils and an iron cross wrapped in red cloth. He declared he would cleanse the land. Whatever is rooted here will be named, he said, and once named, it can be cast out. He was never seen again. At dawn, his satchel was found hanging from a branch near the center path, emptied, its contents replaced by 13 fig leaves arranged in the shape of a crown. No other branch had been disturbed. No wind had blown. The bark bore no cuts. It had not been placed there. It had been accepted. Sheriff Albin Cross, then still clinging to the last brittle remnants of law, recorded the event in his ledger. He marked the page with a red ribbon and began carrying salt in his coat pocket. Before entering his office each morning, he drew a line of it across the threshold. When asked why, he simply muttered, "To remind the roots that I am not theirs." Dreams in Latin, and the girl beneath the tree. That same week, the town's remaining children, those who still spoke, began to share a dream. It was never identical, but the shape of it remained. A girl with black eyes stood beneath a weeping fig tree. Her mouth opened wider than any child should. From it came a hum, not a scream, not a song, but a steady vibration that shook the bones of every house. Even in sleep, children woke with dirt under their fingernails and dried blood at the corners of their mouths. When asked where they had been, they all answered the same. She was remembering us. On the edge of the orchard, the hush house, once believed to be the final structure, no longer stood alone. A new form had risen past the bend where the fig trees curved inward, their trunks bowing like roped elders. The new structure had no color. Not white, not black, not wood, not stone. It bore no seams, no hinges, no ornamentation. It looked as if it had emerged, not built, but birthed from the ground. Its entrance was a narrow slit, barely wide enough for a man to pass sideways, and only if he removed everything, clothes name memory. Enoch Weaver, a veteran of war and of grief, was the first to try. He disrobed calmly, folding his garments as if preparing for baptism. He entered the slit as if stepping into his own grave. He did not return. At dusk, 13 birds landed on the chapel steeple. They were ashen, unmoving, unblinking. The slit in the structure closed the following morning, sealed so smooth it was as if it had never opened. No one ever saw it part again. A town unwritten, and the woman with no past. As the orchard deepened in silence, so too did the forgetting. Records began to vanish. Bibles once engraved with birth dates and marriage vows now contained only faint impressions, verses erased, pages blank, but for the ghost of Scripture long gone. At first people blamed one another. Then they stopped speaking entirely. Margaret Bell awoke one morning to find her marriage certificate gone. In its place, a piece of vellum tucked into her mirror frame read, "You were never his." That afternoon her husband left without shoes or coat. He did not pack. He did not write. He simply stepped outside and disappeared. Margaret was found a week later seated upright in the chapel's front pew. Her hands were clasped around a dried fig crusted in salt. Her eyes had closed too long. They would not open again. Sheriff Cross began keeping watch from the bell tower, spying the orchard through a wartime spyglass. What he saw, he wrote down in a journal page by trembling page. He described figures not as people, but as shapes that moved like memory, flickering uncertain, but always closer. They cast no shadows, they wore veils. His final entry read, "They do not bury the dead. They instruct them." He vanished days later. No one saw him go. No one heard his boots descend the tower stairs. Only the boots remained placed neatly side by side atop the steeple filled with soil and fig seeds. With Cross gone, the last structure of order collapsed. The post office closed. The school bell cracked, and when the orchard bloomed again, the blossoms were shaped not like flowers, but like mouths, each bearing rows of tiny white teeth. And from every petal, if pressed, fell a single drop of salt water. The roots, beneath the frost and the ash, that fell spring, arrived not with thaw, but with retreat. Snow did not melt it, vanished pulling inward as though drawn into the veins of the land. Beneath it lay no green shoots, no crocus blooms, no soft rebirth. Only silver roots exposed like nerves under skin, coiled and glistening just beneath the surface. They twisted, not in the way of plants, but in the way of fingers, clutching tightly, refusing to let go. Paths emerged where none had existed. Stones arranged themselves in spirals, in rings in the shapes of hands, curled around invisible throats. Old fields long fallow sprouted nothing but silence. Then, on the morning after the equinox, the sky opened, not with rain, not with thunder, but with ash. For 13 minutes pale dust fell over Andover. It bore no smell, no warmth. It coated everything, roofs, hats, shoulders, but left no residue. When touched, it disappeared. When inhaled, it whispered. Everyone who stood in it described the same sensation, a weight at the nape of the neck, as if someone had leaned close to murmur their name. Those who turned around saw nothing. Those who didn't claim to dream in Latin that night, they remembered words they had never been taught. Children began disappearing not in the woods, not in the dark, but in daylight. One vanished mid-sentence in a lesson, her voice trailing off into nothing. Another dissolved into sunlight on her mother's lap, replaced by a dusting of petals and a half-folded linen doll. The school teacher who once wrote, "You are remembered" 13 times on her board, left her bell on the desk, walked barefoot into the orchard, and was never seen again. Her shoes were later found hanging from a branch, their laces braided into the bark. The branch did not bend. The slit tower reopens, and the fruit that listens. For the first time since Enoch Weaver vanished, the slit in the unnamed tower reopened. It did not swing or crack, it widened like a mouth stretching in recognition, and from within came one scream, high, sharp, unmistakably childlike, that echoed up the tower's spine and into the orchard's stillness. It was not a scream of fear. Witnesses would later say it sounded like someone recognizing their own name after forgetting it for years. That same night, 13 fig trees in the northern grove bore fruit. For the first time in generations, the figs swelled on the branches, but they were pale and waxy cold to the touch, and each bore the imprint of a human ear pressed gently into the flesh, perfect down to the folds of cartilage. A local doctor, curious and brave, attempted to dissect one. He bled from the nose for 2 days, lost hearing in his left ear, said only, "It listened to me." He hanged himself a week later from the steeple using a length of salt-stained linen. 13 families vanished by month's end. Their homes remained untouched. Pots still bubbled. Water boiled. Beds were made. But no voices, no footprints, no signs of exit. On each front door a mark was left, a crown of thorns pressed into ash salt or something too fine to name. Beneath it, a single word, planted. That night, every fig branch in town swayed even without wind. Some townsfolk claimed to feel their floorboards move subtly beneath their feet, like something deep beneath the foundations was shifting or waking. The listening mouth and the return of mercy. Morning came in silence. The town square stood still. No crows circled the grain stores, no carts creaked. The town's long dry fountain overflowed for the first time in decades, but not with water. The liquid within was thick, dark, and sweet-smelling like honey left too long in the heat. But beneath its sweetness lay something older, salt-rot memory. No one approached it. People had stopped speaking aloud. Words cracked their throats. Voices trembled. Even breathing too deeply felt presumptuous, like trespassing in a house where something sacred was trying to concentrate. Children no longer spoke in sentences, but in drawn shapes. Spirals in frost. Figures in ash. Patterns on barn doors just before dawn. A new one emerged that week, a spiral with 7 points and an open eye at its center. They called it the listening mouth. And then Mercy Fairbanks returned. No one had seen her for nearly a year. She did not speak. She did not blink. Her hair had turned silver at the roots, her dress trailing behind her like mist on morning soil. She walked barefoot into the center of the orchard to the base of the slit tower and placed 13 small bundles wrapped in red cloth in a perfect circle. From the chapel roof, someone watching claimed they breathed. Mercy knelt in the center, bowed her head, and was swallowed in a flash of light so soft it did not hurt to see, but it hurt to understand. When it faded, she was gone. And in her place, the orchard inhaled. Caleb's note and the chapel that breathed. That same night, Andover's last child vanished. His name was Caleb. He had never spoken a word, not from fear, but because an accident during a winter storm had taken his tongue before his 2nd birthday. He communicated through gestures and scribbled notes, usually passed to his mother, folded inside napkins or tucked into her apron pocket. On the morning after Mercy's disappearance, a note was found on a plate beside a halved fig. It was written in his mother's hand, but Caleb had never been taught to write. She said, "I can speak again, but I have to listen first. If I'm quiet enough, I'll remember who I was before." The fig was untouched. His boots remained by the orchard gate. The town had stopped recording dates by then. Calendars hung untouched, watches wound down. Noon felt like evening. Morning brought no hunger. Time had collapsed in on itself like wet paper folding at the edges. And inside the chapel something had changed. The pews had been removed. The altar, once bare and narrow, was gone. In its place stood a low mound of earth in the shape of a sleeping child, knees tucked beneath chest arms, curled around nothing. On the mound, 13 black candles burned. They never melted. Sheriff Cross's journal, recovered years later, soaked in sap and sewn with dried fig leaves, claimed that if one stood close enough to the earthen shape, they could hear breathing. Not beneath it, not beneath the soil, but within it. Each inhale carried the scent of salt and myrrh. Each exhale made the walls sweat, and those who tried to leave, truly leave, never got far. Roads bent back. Horses refused to ride past the orchard's shadow. One man forgot his own name 3 miles out. Another forgot what language was. He could only hum. When asked what he remembered, he knelt, pressed his hand to the dirt and whispered, "My roots are listening." The shift beneath the orchard. Within a week of Mercy's disappearance, the orchard shifted. Not violently, not visibly, no quakes, no thunder, but something underneath had moved, like a great ancient body turning in sleep. Paths changed direction. The hush house, once the second structure along the trail, now stood on the opposite side, mirrored its doorway, facing away from the chapel. Some said the buildings had swapped places. Others said the trail had inverted itself, folding in a way only dreamers could follow. A desperate farmer named Tobias Grin, who had abandoned his tools inside the orchard weeks before, tied a rope around his waist and instructed his son to hold the end from the path's edge. He stepped into the grove, following what he remembered as the shortest way to the hush house. He vanished after 7 steps. The rope went slack. When pulled back, it came coated in something warm and granular, thick like syrup and smelling of earth. His boots were returned the next day, placed neatly outside the chapel. Between them, a small wooden bowl filled to the brim with salt, undisturbed, unspilled. Inside town, well water turned sweet, not with sugar, but with fig and iron and memory. Clorinda Welsh, a widow who had not spoken in months, drank from it at dusk. By dawn she had forgotten her children's names, then the shape of her own hands, then the meaning of words. She was last seen tracing spirals onto the church window pane with her breath. Her reflection grinned back at her, though her face was still. The 13 offerings and the exhale that listened. On the next moonless night, 13 women stood at the edge of the orchard. They had not spoken of this beforehand. They did not gather by invitation or plan. They simply arrived, each holding something wrapped in linen, a child's tooth, a lock of hair, a broken comb, a yellowing photo, a ribbon crusted with dried blood. They placed their offerings on the soil in a slow circle, forming a shape no one had practiced, but all seemed to know. And the earth did not move. Not at first. The bundles sat where they were, left untouched by breeze or breath. The air stilled. Only when the final item, a rosary charred at one end, was laid on the ground did the orchard respond. A low exhale, not from wind, but from root. The trees tilted inward. The leaves trembled in unison. From the direction of the slit tower came a hum, not from throat or tongue, but from the spine of the land. It vibrated through boots, through blood, through memory. The women wept not in fear, but in relief. They had been heard. The next morning, no animals entered town. Dogs barked at doorways, horses bolted at tree lines, even crows ceased circling. Only the fig trees moved, Their branches swayed without wind as if rocked by lullabies no human voice dared hum. At dawn, the hush-house door stood open, but it no longer faced inward. It watched the town, the mirror and the tree that wept salt. The hush-house door had been open for days now, yet no one dared enter. But those who walked past its warped frame, those who listened, claimed they heard voices within, not speaking, not breathing, listening, always listening. Inside, the pews had returned, but they no longer faced the altar. Instead, every pew had been turned around, now facing the rear wall where a large mirror had been hung. It wasn't there before. No one had placed it. No one had built it, and it reflected nothing. Not the pews, not the room, not the viewer. Only a single image could be seen always behind whoever looked. A bent fig tree, its bark split its limbs, slumped as though in mourning. From its cracked trunk, salt water wept in steady drops, thick and slow like tears that had been waiting centuries to fall. A few braver souls entered the hush-house after the third day. They returned, changed mute, slow to blink eyes, glassy as if a film had grown over their gaze. They stared not at people, but through them. Some took to writing on walls in charcoal. Others spent hours washing their hands, raw, murmuring, "It touched me. It saw through me." Sheriff Cross's final journal entry was recovered by a root cellar years later, its pages stuck together with sap. He wrote of the mirror in his final scrawl. It doesn't reflect the orchard. It reflects the orchard's memory. The last page was blank, until held to flame. Then faintly, like something rising from ash, came the whisper of a child's voice. "We are what was buried, and we are growing back." The tilt of the town and the map of a hand. By the second week of April, the land itself had begun to tilt. Not enough to cause alarm, not enough to crack walls or shift furniture, but just enough that fences leaned, that foundations creaked, that barns slid inches in the night without storm or tremor. The tilt wasn't toward the river, nor the hills, it was toward the orchard. Andover had begun to bow. A blacksmith named Eli Dotter awoke one morning to find his barn had moved nearly 2 feet overnight. Inside, every tool had been arranged on the floor, not scattered, not stored, but placed. Blades, hammers, hooks, even his anvil had been positioned in a widespread pattern. It wasn't random. It was a hand. Not a drawing of one, but a full anatomical map. Fingers splayed, knuckles mapped with spikes. The anvil was the palm. The forge bellows had been ripped apart and tucked under what would have been the wrist. Eli never spoke of it. He packed his cart, hitched his horse, and tried to flee. They found him circling the orchard 3 mornings in a row. On the 4th, he died in his sleep. His mouth was filled with fig seeds. His eyelids had been lined with salt. The local doctor refused to sign a cause of death. "He's not the first to come back wrong," the doctor muttered. "He's just the first who didn't stay." And then the humming began again. Not voices, not breath, but resonance. The chapel vibrated with a frequency that passed through bone. People woke at 3:16 a.m. without alarms. Always the same minute, always the same story. Footsteps in their homes, slow, deliberate, never rushed, and a smell fig bark and soil like someone had walked straight through the orchard and into their dreams. The handprints in the frost and the letters with no names. One woman woke to find her daughter standing at the window. The child's back was turned, her hands folded, her eyes closed, but tears streamed silently down her cheeks. She didn't move for nearly an hour, and when she did, she whispered, "They're almost finished remembering me. Just a little longer." The next morning, she was gone. No door opened, no footprints in the snow. Just 13 tiny handprints pressed into the frost outside, perfectly spaced, all pointing toward the orchard. That same week, 13 letters arrived at the chapel, each sealed with dark green wax marked with a crown of thorns, each addressed to a name that no longer appeared on the town census. Inside every envelope was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in a language no one could identify. Curves and flourishes that seemed to breathe on their own, like roots spreading under paper skin. The last schoolteacher left in Andover, her husband lost her voice, stolen months before, sat alone in the vestry studying the letters. She didn't sleep. She didn't eat. She stared at the symbols until she wept. Then she locked herself in. By dawn, she walked barefoot down the orchard path, eyes pale as bone, and entered the hush house. She never returned. Her journal was found hours later on her desk. It contained only one entry. "The orchard knows the shape of every name we've buried. It has not forgiven us." That night, no one lit the chapel lamps, but the building still glowed from within. Soft silver light, steady, waiting. And from the pews came the sound of mouths opening, not speaking, not singing, listening, the bell beneath the soil and the voice without words. In the final weeks before Andover vanished from all official maps, a sound returned. It was not the toll of the chapel bell. It had long since fallen, cracked and rotting. This bell rang beneath the town. It did not echo through air, but shuddered through the ground, a subsonic tolling that made window panes hum and basin water ripple. Every floorboard trembled in sync, every bowl of water danced without wind. And those who felt it did not ask, "What is it?" but who remembers. The toll came 13 times, always at dusk, always followed by stillness so deep it made sleep impossible. But sleep had already begun to change. Dreams no longer brought rest, they delivered revelation. And what they revealed could not be spoken aloud. People dreamed of stairwells carved into root systems, steps spiraling downward into pulp and ash. They dreamed of pulpits made of vine and bone, of congregations veiled in skin that pulsed with breath. They dreamed of mouths stitched closed, of eyes opening where no face should be, and of doorways sealed with hair, yet trembling as if about to speak. No dreamer ever described hearing a voice, but they all understood the same message. You are the fruit of silence. You will ripen in time. And then one morning, just as fog unrolled across the fields like a burial cloth, the slit tower stood ajar once more. But it had changed. No longer narrow and vertical, it had widened into a circle, like a mouth stretched wide in recognition. Not hunger, not threat, invitation. 13 people rose from their homes that day without speaking. They were not called, they were not summoned. They simply knew. They walked barefoot toward the orchard, leaving behind tokens: a child's shoe on the porch, a lock of hair in a bowl of salt, a comb laid gently on a pillow. None returned, and no one stopped them, because by then there was nothing in Andover left to stop anything at all. The green smoke and the forgotten names. The tower did not close, it breathed. For 13 days it remained open, silent, watching. On the 13th night it exhaled, not with breath, not with light, but with smoke, a thick green vapor that rolled outward in low curls, hugging the ground, spilling into homes and beneath beds. It did not burn. It unwrote. Those who inhaled it did not feel pain. They felt absence. They wept before portraits of strangers that wore their mothers' faces. They forgot the names of their siblings, the shape of their own signatures. One woman found her wedding dress folded on her bed, still warm, but had no memory of being married. The town clock rusted and, long frozen at midnight, chimed once as the smoke passed through its gears. One perfect note, and then silence again. In the homes of the vanished fig branches had begun to grow, not from vases or gardens, but from baseboards creeping in slowly, gently like returning tenants. The wood pulsed faintly to the touch, warm as skin and soft as memory. Children whispered to their parents that the trees weren't intruding. They were coming home. "We borrowed this house," one boy said, while they were underground. When asked who they were, the child pointed to the orchard and whispered, "The saints we planted, the story that doesn't end, only waits." In those final impossible days, Andover became not a town, but a memory, refusing burial. Maps no longer marked it. Postal routes diverted themselves. Travelers turned back with no explanation, their horses refusing to move forward past a certain bend in the road. Those who lived nearby spoke only in legend. Some claimed to see lights moving between the trees at night. Others said they heard music not played, but remembered a lullaby older than any hymn felt deep in the chest before it ever reached the ears. A hiker found fig leaves in her sink. A school teacher in a distant town awoke with the word "ripened" scrawled across her mirror in ash. No one had been inside. No one needed to. Andover was no longer a place. It had been folded into the land, into the breath of trees, into the silence beneath words. The orchard had rooted itself not in soil, but in story. And some stories do not end. They simply settle deeper, seed-like, waiting to be remembered. Remembering was the orchard's final prayer, and it was still being answered. Even now, even here, even by you, the last seed, and the voice behind the pages. The final marker of what Andover had once been was not a grave. It was a letter. Not signed, not dated, not sealed in wax, but in sap thick and amber, still tacky to the touch. It had been nailed to a leaning fence post at the edge of what used to be the county line, where the road now curved away without reason, where maps creased as if resisting ink. The paper smelled of fig skin and rain. Its message was written in a looping, childlike hand, the sort only the newly literate or the deeply ancient might possess. The saints are finished listening now. They will speak. The postman who phoned it burned every other letter in his satchel. He never delivered mail again. When asked why he wept and said the handwriting matched his mother's, she had died 30 years before. In the years that followed, stories of Andover fractured. Officials dismissed it as a town dissolved by economic collapse, swallowed by blight. Clerks cited weather records. Farmers cited poor yields. But the land told another story. People nearby whispered of an orchard that still stood, though no one had entered in decades. Of trees that bore no fruit but never died. Of shadows among the limbs that didn't match the bodies casting them. Of music not sung but remembered. Not with ears, with bone. Those who ventured too close returned, altered. One hiker claimed to have seen a circle of children seated in pews, grown from vine and root, their mouths open in unison. Not singing, not weeping, just open. Another found fig leaves growing in her sink. Another woke to find a single word written in ash across her mirror. Ripened. No new maps mark Andover now. The roads bend away from it. GPS signals drop. Digital maps blur and blink. But those who listen, truly listen at the edge of the orchard, say they can hear it still, the turning of pages in a book that does not burn. And behind the rustle, a voice neither cruel nor kind, reading the same lines again and again. Not to teach, not to warn, to remember. Because the orchard is no longer content to listen, it is learning to speak, and stories like this, they don't end. They echo. They take root in silence. They wait. Andover wasn't forgotten. It was buried with care by something older than doctrine, older than fire, older than the need to ask for permission. It does not want your belief, only your stillness, only your listening. So if you've heard all this, if you've followed the hum beneath the soil, the breath behind the mirrors, the songs that ring from throats sewn, closed, then you already know. Some saints do not wear names. Some seeds were never meant to grow fruit, only memory. And if you see a girl barefoot in the road tomorrow morning, dust on her ankles and a fig blossom in her palm, and she asks you, do you wish to speak with the ones who remember you? Answer carefully, because the orchard is listening, and it always remembers.